I used to believe that 40 years of love could withstand anything. 40 years of devotion, of building a life, a home, a family. Robert and I had weathered every storm together, until the one that took everything from us. The hurricane came without mercy, tearing through our quiet town like a thief in the night, stealing what we spent decades creating. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling our windows, shaking our walls, and in the end, reducing our sanctuary to something unrecognizable. The house we had made a home was now a shell of its former self, broken, battered, and barely standing. We had no choice but to leave. Our daughter Elena welcomed us with open arms, offering us shelter in her beautiful, pristine home. I should have felt nothing but relief, but the moment I stepped through her front door, something inside me shifted. It wasn't mine. The walls were too white, the furniture too perfect, the air filled with the scent of candles instead of the familiar aroma of my own kitchen. I told myself to be grateful. I was grateful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding, that no matter how much Elena reassured me, this wasn't where I belonged. Robert, on the other hand, seemed eager to escape the weight of our new reality. At first it was small things, pacing around the house, restless hands fidgeting with nothing to fix, nothing to do. I understood. Losing our home felt like losing a part of ourselves, and for Robert, that loss came with an unbearable silence. So I encouraged him. Go out, get some fresh air, take a drive. And he did. But the drives got longer. The fresh air turned into late nights. And when I asked where he had been, the answers were vague, floating in the air between us like smoke. At first I convinced myself that I was overthinking it. 40 years of marriage meant trust, didn't it? Robert had always been a man of habit, and maybe this was just his way of coping. Maybe he just needed space, time to clear his head, to adjust to the loss of our home. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. So when he'd sigh and mutter, "I just needed to get out for a bit," I forced a smile, even when something inside me twisted uncomfortably. But then, the gaps in time grew wider. He'd leave in the afternoon and come back after dark, avoiding my eyes as he set his keys down on the counter. No explanations, no reassurances, just the faint scent of something unfamiliar clinging to his clothes. I told myself it was probably nothing, that it had to be nothing. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the tightness in my chest, the unease curling in my stomach every time he stepped out the door. One night I tried to bring it up gently. I told him I missed him, that I felt like we were drifting. I reached for his hand across the dinner table, but he pulled away before I could touch him. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, but I noticed. The warmth that had always been between us, the quiet understanding that needed no words, it was slipping. And in its place, a distance I didn't know how to close. I could have pushed. I could have demanded answers. But I didn't. Not yet. Because if I said it out loud, if I gave voice to the fear whispering at the edges of my mind, then it would be real. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I started watching him more closely. The way he'd check his phone, always turning it slightly away from me. The way he'd linger before answering simple questions. The way he'd leave, not in a hurry, but with the kind of ease that suggested he wasn't worried about time or about me waiting for him. One evening, I stood by the window and watched as he drove away. The headlights disappeared down the street, swallowed by the night. My hands gripped the curtain, knuckles white, and a thought surfaced in my mind. Quiet at first, then louder. What if he isn't just driving? I shook it off. No, not Robert. Not after 40 years. But doubt doesn't let go once it finds a crack. It settles in, spreads, turns the things you once trusted into questions you don't want to answer. That night I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling while the sound of the clock filled the silence beside me. I had spent a lifetime beside this man, sharing everything, our joys, our grief, our dreams. And yet, for the first time in my marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own life. When he finally came home, I kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. I listened as he moved through the room, undressing quietly, slipping beneath the covers. I wanted to turn to him, to ask, "Where were you? What's happening to us?" But instead, I lay still, feeling the cold space between us, and wondered if I had already lost him. Doubt is a slow poison. It starts as a whisper, a nagging thought you try to push away. But then it lingers. It waits in the silence between conversations, in the empty spaces where love used to live. And before you know it, it's everywhere. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that Robert was just adjusting, that losing our home had unsettled him. But deep down, I knew better. He wasn't the same. The man who used to reach for my hand absent-mindedly, who would tease me about burning toast or hum old songs in the kitchen, he was slipping away. He stopped touching me, stopped looking at me the way he used to, and when I asked where he'd been, his answers were clipped, impatient. Nowhere special. Just needed some air. "Why are you making a big deal out of this?" I wasn't making a big deal. At least, I didn't think I was. I just wanted to understand. I wanted to hold on to something, some proof that I wasn't losing my husband to something I couldn't see. But every time I reached for him, he pulled away just a little more. And then there was the defensiveness. The way his shoulders tensed when I so much as asked how his day had been. The way he'd sigh, exasperated, like my questions were a burden instead of a sign that I cared. It was subtle at first. A shift in his tone, a flicker of annoyance. But the more I noticed it, the more I couldn't unsee it. I wanted to trust him. I needed to trust him. 40 years of marriage doesn't just disappear overnight. It's built on love, on faith, on knowing someone so well that you can predict their next move. But suddenly, I couldn't predict Robert anymore. His patterns had changed. The small things, the way he used to kiss my forehead in passing, the way he'd laugh at my silly stories, the way he always reached for my hand in crowded rooms, were all gone. In their place was distance, cold and growing. Still, I made excuses. Maybe he was struggling, feeling powerless after losing the house. Maybe he was too proud to admit how much it weighed on him. I told myself 100 different things, all to avoid the one thought creeping into my mind. The thought I didn't want to name, but my body knew what my heart refused to admit. It was in the way my stomach tightened when he grabbed his keys, the way my hands trembled when I reached for my phone, debating whether to call him, to ask where he was. The way my chest ached when I heard the garage door close and knew, just knew, that he wasn't going for a simple drive. I told myself, we've been together for 40 years. He wouldn't betray me now. But doubt is relentless. And once it finds a home in your mind, it never really leaves. The night I made my decision, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Elena was out with friends, and Robert, as usual, had vanished hours ago. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched cup of tea, feeling the weight of something I could no longer ignore. The woman I used to be, the one who trusted without question, who believed in the strength of her marriage, was fading. In her place, someone new was taking shape. Someone who refused to sit in the dark, waiting for answers that would never come. I took a slow breath, pushed back my chair, and stood. My hands were steady as I grabbed my coat, my keys. I wasn't even sure when I had made the decision, but now that it was here, it felt inevitable. I wasn't going to ask anymore. I wasn't going to beg for reassurance that wasn't coming. I was going to find out for myself. The driveway was empty, just like it had been every night for weeks. I slid into my car, my fingers gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. My heart pounded, but my mind was clear. I didn't have a plan. I just had instinct. And instinct told me to follow. As I pulled onto the road, scanning every turn, every stretch of darkness ahead, I realized something. I wasn't just looking for Robert, I was looking for the truth. The road stretched out before me, slick with the remnants of an earlier rain, reflecting the glow of streetlights like shards of broken glass. I kept my distance, trailing Robert's car as he weaved through familiar streets with a certainty I no longer recognized. My fingers were tight on the wheel, my pulse a steady drum in my ears. Part of me still clung to the hope that I was wrong, that this would end with nothing more than guilt for ever doubting him. but then he turned. Not toward the grocery store or the gas station, not toward any place I could explain away. He turned down a quiet side street, pulled into a small parking lot, and killed the engine. A cafe. Not just any cafe. The kind with warm lighting spilling onto the sidewalk. The kind with soft music and cozy booths meant for stolen moments. My breath hitched as I watched him step out of the car. And then she appeared. She was younger, half my age, maybe less. She moved toward him easily, as if this was routine, as if she belonged there, waiting for my husband. And Robert? He smiled. Not the polite smile he had given me lately, the distant, hollow curve of his lips. No. This was a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in months, the kind I used to believe was mine. I gripped the steering wheel, my nails digging into the leather. My body went numb, but my mind sharpened. 40 years. 40 years. And he had thrown it away in the time it took to open a car door. I couldn't move. My hands were locked onto the steering wheel, my breath shallow, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. I told myself to look away, to stop watching before the damage became permanent. But I couldn't. I was frozen in place, a spectator to my own unraveling. Robert reached for her hand, curling his fingers around hers with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. They walked inside together, her laughter floating through the air as if it belonged there, as if she belonged with him. He held the door open for her, something he hadn't done for me in years. The realization stung, sharp and undeniable. The memories flooded in all at once. Our wedding day, the nights we stayed up talking until the sun came up, the way he used to trace circles on my back when he thought I was asleep. Had it all been a lie? Or worse? Had it just faded, piece by piece, until there was nothing left? I wanted to scream, to march inside and demand answers, to force him to see me, to remember me. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could feel something shifting inside me, something dark and quiet, something I didn't fully recognize yet. The woman I had been, the wife who would have cried, who would have begged for an explanation, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone who wasn't going to break. Not yet. I don't remember how long I sat there, watching them through the window. Time had no meaning in that moment, only the slow, gut-wrenching unraveling of everything I thought I knew. They sat close, their hands brushing, their smiles easy. There was no hesitation, no guilt in Robert's posture, just comfort, just familiarity, as if this wasn't new, as if I were the intruder in their world, and not the other way around. I should have cried, maybe the old me would have, but the tears didn't come. Instead, something cold and sharp settled in my chest. A quiet kind of rage, patient and calculating. I wasn't going to storm inside and scream. I wasn't going to throw a drink in his face or cause a scene. No, he didn't deserve that kind of reaction. He didn't deserve anything from me. So I watched. I memorized the way she laughed, the way he leaned in closer, the way he looked at her, the way he used to look at me. And then, without a word, I turned the key in the ignition and drove away. Because I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to crumble. I was going to make him regret ever thinking he could betray me and get away with it. I spent the next few days in silence, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I was planning, watching, calculating. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath my ribs, but it didn't consume me the way I thought it would. If anything, it fueled me. Grief and rage are two sides of the same coin, and I had no intention of letting this grief bury me. No, I was going to turn it into something sharper, something he wouldn't see coming. It wasn't hard to figure out their routine. They met at the same cafe, always around the same time. I imagined their conversations, the lies he must have told her, the stories he had rewritten to justify his betrayal. Did he pretend I was cold, distant, a wife who had stopped loving him? The thought made my stomach turn. I had given him my entire life. I had stood by him through failures and triumphs, through sickness and health, through the long, winding years that had carved deep lines into our faces, And this was my reward. But I wasn't going to beg for answers. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. No, I had something much better planned. The plan was simple, precise. A quiet, calculated strike where it would hurt him most. Not his pride, not his ego, but his comfort. Because that's what betrayal is, isn't it? It thrives in secrecy, in the safety of stolen moments where consequences don't exist. And I was going to rip that safety away. I arrived at the cafe early, slipping into a corner booth where the shadows stretched long across the floor. The air smelled of roasted coffee and warm pastries, the kind of scent that once would have brought me comfort. Not today. Today it was just a backdrop to my final act as Robert's wife. The door chimed, and there he was, smiling, relaxed, lighter than I had seen him in years. And her. She reached for his hand before they even sat down, her laugh bright, effortless. For a moment, I wondered if she even knew about me, if she had ever questioned the way he slipped away in the evenings, the way he hid his phone, the way his wedding band no longer left an imprint on his finger. It didn't matter. I wasn't here for her. I was here for him. I caught the waitress's eye and gestured her over. She was young, maybe in college, with a friendly smile. I returned it, calm, composed. "I'd like to send a coffee to that gentleman over there," I said smoothly, handing her a $5 bill. "Make sure it goes directly to him. And can you slip this into the sleeve?" I held out a small folded note, my handwriting neat, controlled. The waitress hesitated for only a second before nodding. Of course. And then I sat back, waiting. I didn't take my eyes off him as the waitress carried the coffee to his table. He was mid-conversation, smiling, completely at ease in his little secret world. But the moment the cup was set in front of him, his expression changed. Confusion flickered across his face as he looked up at the waitress, then around the cafe, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't expecting this. Good. He reached for the cup, his fingers grazing the sleeve, and then he saw it. The small, folded note tucked neatly inside. His breath stilled. I could see it. The slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled just a fraction too tight around the cup. His mistress was still talking, oblivious, sipping her drink as if the man in front of her hadn't just been pulled into a waking nightmare. Slowly, he unfolded the note. "You threw away 40 years of love and loyalty for this. Enjoy it." I watched the color drain from his face. It wasn't just shock. It was something deeper. Panic. The kind that only comes when the walls of a carefully built lie start to collapse. His head lifted, scanning the cafe, his gaze darting from table to table. He was searching for me, desperate to find me. But I was already on my feet. I had seen enough. Without a word, without a single glance back, I slipped out the door and into the cool evening air. The night felt different now, lighter. As if I had just shed the weight of something I had carried for far too long. Robert may have made his choice, but now, so had I. And for the first time in weeks, I felt free. I didn't go back to Elena's house right away. Instead, I drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring through my windshield, the cool night air pressing against my skin. My hands were steady on the wheel, my heart calm. It was strange how easy it felt. How I had spent weeks drowning in uncertainty, in fear, in pain, only to find that, in the end, leaving him wasn't the hard part. It was accepting that he had already left me a long time ago. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light Elena always left on for me. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and for the first time since the storm that had taken our home, I truly felt the loss. Not just of the house, but of the life I thought I had. The version of my marriage I had clung to so desperately. But loss isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's just clearing the way. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. I already knew what I would find. Missed calls, unread messages, desperate attempts to undo what had already been done. He would beg, he would plead, he would try to explain. But there was nothing left to explain. And I had nothing left to say. The messages started coming before sunrise. First, A simple grace, please. Then longer ones. Apologies, explanations, excuses. It's not what you think. I made a mistake. Please, just talk to me. I didn't respond. By mid-morning, the calls began. I let them ring, listening to the silence after each one. The man who had barely spoken to me in weeks was now desperate to hear my voice. The irony of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Elena noticed, of course. She always did. "Mom?" she asked gently, setting a cup of coffee in front of me as I sat at the kitchen table. "Are you okay?" I looked at my daughter, at the home she had built, at the life she had created for herself. Strong, independent, unapologetically her own person. And for the first time in a long time, I saw myself in her. Not the woman I had been with Robert, but the woman I was before him. The woman I could still be. I picked up the coffee, took a slow sip, and met her eyes. I will be. And for the first time in weeks, I truly believed it. Days passed, and the calls slowed. The messages grew shorter, then stopped altogether. I imagined Robert sitting alone in whatever space he now occupied, waiting for a reply that would never come. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow. Just the quiet relief of a door closing for good. One afternoon, I walked to the mirror and truly looked at myself. Not through the lens of a wife or a mother, not as someone defined by years of loyalty to a man who had forgotten its worth. I saw me. The lines around my eyes, the silver threads in my hair, the strength in the set of my jaw. I traced my fingers over my own reflection, as if reacquainting myself with someone I had once known but lost along the way. I thought about the years I had spent making space for him, his dreams, his needs, his comforts. The way I had dimmed parts of myself, softened my edges, made compromises that chipped away at who I was. And for what? For this? No more. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I poured myself a glass of wine, stepped onto the back porch, and let myself imagine a future that had nothing to do with him. And for the first time in my life, the thought of being alone didn't scare me. It felt like freedom.